I want to take the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker today, Billy Shore. His bio, as everybody else's, is in your packet, and I bet for a lot of our members of the audience today here in Falk Auditorium as well as around the country, he actually needs no introduction. He's one of the leading thinkers and doers in America on solving poverty, and particularly on the issue of hunger, as the founder and the president of Share Our Strength. It is a real honor to have Billy here today to speak on the subject from his really, really valuable vantage point. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Billy Shore.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I have absorbed so much fabulous information this morning. I just want to start by asking everybody to join me in congratulating Elizabeth and Al on this very important book. Fantastic. I'm going to be brief both because the hour is late and because I recently had a very sobering conversation with my 8-year-old son about my speaking style, and I'm going to just leave aside for a moment the improbability of my having an 8-year-old son, which didn't seem improbable to me. But I got my Facebook messages, my wife Rosemary and Nate and myself, and I got a text from a Facebook message from a woman I went to high school with, and she said, I saw you on Facebook, isn't it wonderful? I have a grandson too. So, but in any case, Nate he misbehaved recently with his babysitter for the first time, and he's such a good kid all the time. And my wife got very concerned about it. She called me at work. She said, you have to come home early. We have to talk to Nate about the choices he makes, his character, and his purpose on the planet. And Rosemary is an amazing mom, but a little bit intense. So we had this conversation, which was mostly a monologue, with Rode doing most of the monologuing. And afterwards, Nate was very polite. He just looked us dead in the eye. But afterwards, she had the very good sense, Rosemary, to say to Nate, is there anything in turn now that you would like to say to Dad and I? He just looked us dead in the eye, and he said, thank you for your little presentation. So I try to wrap up before I evoke that in audiences. And what I'd like to do is just make a couple comments that I think will pull together some of the themes that we heard here today. I was thinking of Luis's very compelling comments about this trajectory of the war on poverty and where we are today. And I actually, as you were talking, I thought of something else my son said, because I think it's an interesting blend of the idealism and the pragmatism that we have to bring to this fight. We get to spend a little bit of the summer at a little place called Goose Rocks Beach in Maine, and one morning Nate was down by the water's edge, and there was another man with his 7 or 8-year-old down by the water's edge, and I saw him look around, and then he came up to me, and I saw he and Nate talking, and he came up to me and he said, is that your boy? Is that other boy down there? And I said, yeah, why? And of course I had this constriction in my chest because I know the kind of things that Nate can say. And he said, well, I was building a sandcastle with my son, and your boy came up and he said something very interesting to me. He said, we're down there by the water's edge building the sandcastle, and your boy comes up and he puts his hands on his hips and he says, just so you know, I've seen a lot of these and they're never here in the morning. Now, that's one of the things that, one of the reasons I think that we have to make sure this time is different in terms of this, what I think of as this rededication that this morning is all about to this fight on poverty. What can we do to make this different? And the three things I'd like to talk about are, one is why this challenge is so difficult. 2 is how we can do this work more powerfully. And 3 is what's at stake. In terms of why it's so difficult, to me at the heart of it is the issue of that some problems are so affect people who are so vulnerable and voiceless that there simply are no markets for solving them. There are no economic markets, there are no political markets, or at least those markets have failed in the way that we expect them to work. And so many of the organizations that are represented in this room, many nonprofit and many community organizations, bear this burden of having to fill in the gap, of having to solve this problem where the markets fail. That is the toughest possible thing to do. And it almost always has to do with people being voiceless. We've heard talk about poverty that is invisible. I'll give you one example of this from our work, which to me underscores what goes to the very heart of this. We're an anti-hunger organization that works primarily on childhood hunger in the United States at Share Our Strength. And one of the things that we know is that people in this country are not hungry because we lack food. We enjoy it in abundance. They're not hungry because we lack food and nutrition programs. We have those as well, and we've had them with bipartisan support for almost 50 years, whether it's school lunch program or the SNAP program, school breakfast or summer meals. Kids are hungry because they lack access to those programs. So the one example I'll tell you is that there's 21 million kids in the United States who get a free school lunch. They're all eligible for breakfast as well, for school breakfast, but only 11 million of the 21 million get it. And in the summertime when the schools are closed, only 3 million get it. Legislative programs that all of us and our predecessors fought for and won, and yet 84% of the kids who need meals in the summertime don't get it, and almost 50% of the kids who need breakfast don't get it. Why is that? Perfect example. I go out to Colorado and have a conversation with Governor Ritter when he was governor just a few years ago before their current governor, Hickenlooper. Governor Bill Ritter, terrific man, I think, former Peace Corps volunteer, worked on nutrition programs in, I think, Zambia for 3 years. So I knew that he was, kind of sympathetically connected to what we were doing. And I went and talked to the governor. This was in the, shortly after their economy had turned down like other state economies. He was in his office with, literally legal pads full of budget figures and trying to figure out this state budget crisis. And we made some small talk, and he said, look, just before you say anything, he says, I don't have any money for anything. Okay, and I said, well, I know that. I said, and I'm here for a reason maybe slightly different than you would expect. I'm here because Colorado ranks 47th lowest out of 50 states in the percentage of kids who are eligible for these programs. 47th lowest, which means that you've left at least, by the most conservative estimates, $100 million in Washington that would be feeding these kids, would be buying milk from local dairy farmers, would be buying bread from local bakers, would be a win-win for everybody. And Governor Ritter turned to a staff person, as did Governor Perdue in North Carolina when I had this conversation, Governor McDonnell, Republican governor of Virginia, Governor O'Malley in Maryland, Governor Snyder in Michigan, looked at his staff person and said, is that possibly true? Right, at this time where we're as desperate as we are financially, that we've left $100 million in Washington, and they kind of do their calculation, yes sir, yes ma'am, that is true. And Governor Ritter said, well, why do we need this nice fellow from Washington to come tell us this? And to me, it was such a testament to just how voiceless and invisible these kids are, whether they're in urban areas, whether they're in suburban areas. A good governor who wants to solve problems, who is desperate to find money, doesn't even know that there's $100 million that can't be used for anything else but these kids. An entitlement program so small in the scheme of things that it's exempt from sequestration with Democratic and Republican support in an era where a lot of things are going away for kids, one of the few things that can be counted on. And this good governor doesn't know about it. It's an example of just how profound this voicelessness is and why these are such difficult problems to solve. But they are solvable. And in this second category of how do we do this work more powerfully, I want to just mention a couple of the strategies that at both Share Our Strength and our sister organization, Community Wealth Partners, we've brought to bear in this campaign to end childhood hunger around the country and to really think about its connection to the deeper issues of poverty. We know that poverty is complex, but we know that feeding a child is not. And so we've thought of 5 particular things that we had to bring to every aspect of what we were doing. One was just a very simple notion that we think of as go big or go home. This idea that you should set a bold but believable goal. I like to think of what the writer Jonathan Kozol talks about when he says pick battles that are big enough to matter but small enough to win. That seemed to be a construct that we wanted to really aim towards. And we said that we were going to, as we drilled down on all of the areas that we were working, because we were working on international hunger, we were working on hunger across all levels, we said childhood hunger in this country, really for the reasons that I was just describing, is a solvable problem. And we said, and we're going to actually make our goal to end it by a time certain. It had such a powerful impact on our organization to do that. Most of our colleagues who we work with in our anti-hunger community were actually against the idea. They had all kinds of concerns about what would it take and what if we failed and wouldn't that cost a lot of money and what about all of the other issues and so forth. Our corporate partners, our donors, our stakeholders, more broadly defined, all had the mirror image opposite reaction. You're telling me there's a goal line and you know how far you are from it and what it takes to get across. We want to be part of that. So this notion of go big or go home became central for us. The second thing we realized, and I think this is true for every organization represented in this room as you think about how to do this work more powerfully, is that we had to assert that capacity equals impact, that investing in our own capacity has a direct correlation between the impact that we want to have, and that we had to find ways to eradicate these false distinctions that are made about overhead and administrative expenses and so forth. Everybody who works in our organization is working towards the programmatic goal of ending childhood hunger, and we had to invest in our own capacity, sometimes even at the expense in the short term of funds that might have gone for more direct service or for more programmatic efforts. But we had to have this long-term vision in mind of how do we build our competitive strengths as an organization, and how do we make those investments that may not pay off until the long term, but will certainly be worth it. And that meant investing in talent in ways that we had never done before. That meant investing in branding in ways and in public relations and in communications in ways that we hadn't done before. I should tell you, and I use this only as a proxy because it's not an indicator of impact itself, but as we started to make some of these changes, we saw our revenues grow from, in 2006, 7, and 8, like many organizations, we're 28 years old now, we had plateaued, we were stuck, we were raising and spending about $13 million a year. We started this organization 28 years ago, my sister and I, who's in the back of the room, with a $2,000 cash advance on a Visa card. We've raised about $380 million so far today. But by 2006, 7, and 8, we had plateaued a little bit. We felt stuck, but the needs were increasing. And so we started to make these investments. We started to adopt these strategies. 2009, our revenues were 19 million. 2010, they were 26 million. 2011, 33 million. Last year, 44 million. This year at about 50 million. Not a threat to the Ford Foundation yet, but for us, significant amount of growth, and it really, for us, changed the way we were able to do our work. So this notion that capacity equals impact. Third, accountability, such a powerful differentiator in a crowded marketplace where, regardless of how many people are committed to the work that each of us in our organizations are doing, they're being bombarded by other appeals, other solicitations, other opportunities to make change in the world as well. There's no apples to apples measurements. How do you judge whether it makes more sense to invest in Teach for America or a college summit or venture philanthropy partners or City Year or Share Our Strength? It's very hard to tell. So we decided that at least if we could give people the sense that we are holding ourselves accountable to a very specific outcome, and you can measure against how we are doing. And we can tell our stakeholders, we know, for example, that in 2012, we added 32,000 kids to the school breakfast program in the state of Maryland. 2011 and 2012, the single biggest increase ever. But we also know that we still have 54,000 left to go before we're done. And our stakeholders can, in any state and nationally, look and see how we're doing. It's a double-edged sword. When we're hitting our goals, investment increases in our work, as it should. When we're not hitting them, it decreases, probably as it should, as painful as that is to recognize. So this notion that accountability can be a powerful differentiator, I think also very important. Fourth, and this goes without saying to those who are both tuned into the webcast and those in this room, public policy, such a critical component to this work. I think the last question was about social entrepreneurship, and it was a good question, and many of us are considered to be part of the social entrepreneurial community. But I would argue that social entrepreneurship without being tied to public policy is kind of like a garage band without amps. It's something that everybody thinks is very cool and hip, but it doesn't really get heard very far beyond the neighborhood. When we started to understand as an organization that had been involved in the really almost completely in the private sector, funding food banks, funding emergency food assistance, funding advocacy efforts, but not looking directly like this strategy to increase participation in school breakfast, to increase participation in summer meals and other programs, not looking directly at the impact public policy could have, we realized that we were shortchanging our potential impact. And so what we've done on a state-by-state basis is to go in and try to understand what are the barriers to kids getting these meals. We found out that one of the most important things you could do is move breakfast and this didn't require any money, but this was somebody after 50 years finally rethinking an important program. For 50 years, since generals and admirals came to Congress and said, we need to feed kids lunch and breakfast so we've got stronger troops, which is what they did after World War II. For 50 years, they've served breakfast, lunch in the cafeteria, and also breakfast in the cafeteria. Well, it's harder to get kids to go to breakfast in the cafeteria because they have to get to school early, and most of us can barely get our kids to school on time, wherever we live, whatever our means. There's also, for many kids, there was this stigma attached to being the kids who went to school early. Somebody came up with the idea of, why don't we move breakfast from the cafeteria to the first 10 minutes of the first period? Well, it turns out everybody objected to that idea. Teachers' unions said that our contracts say we don't have to clean up spilled milk, and the janitor said, you know, our contract says we pick up the trash at 3:30, and the PTA said this might take away from instructional time. Los Angeles is a good example. We worked for a year in one school to launch breakfast in the classroom for the first 10 minutes over all of these objections, and 1 year later, Mayor Villarosa and Superintendent of Schools John Daisy decided to roll it into 630 schools, which the school board voted on 7-0 last week, so that these kids get breakfast. Because what they've understood, what teachers will now tell you is it doesn't detract from education time. It actually increases it because every kid's in every seat on time. So we've been going and trying to rethink some of these, the way we've done things for a long time, in the interest of making public policy work. I think as Angela was saying, you know, and Mary was saying, identifying programs that work and making sure that they get scaled. Finally, we've talked a lot about collaboration, and Collaborate was up on the screen in a big way. We do as much of that, I think, as anybody does at Share Our Strength. But we believe that we all also need to learn how to compete. Not to compete to put anybody else out of business, but to compete to be the very best, most powerful version of ourselves. I was on the board of the Timberland boot and clothing company for about 11 years. Makes boots and apparel, and I'd never been on a corporate board. And one of the things I noticed, there were two things different from all the nonprofit boards I've been on, and I've been on many. One is at Timberland, when they made really important decisions, they made them on the basis of information. This was a huge shock to my system. I remember calling the office and saying, I think there's another way to do this, folks. But the other thing I noticed at Timberland was the board and the senior management of the organization was very focused on whether the company was organized to outperform its peers. And they were particularly focused on the belief that to compete at any level, you must compete at every level. So they understood that they weren't competing to sell us a pair of boots. They were competing to get the best people who work in fashion and footwear to come and work at Timberland, and to make sure they're being paid competitively, and that they're staying at Timberland longer than their peers stay at Cole Haan or Reebok or Echo or what have you. They weren't just competing to sell us T-shirts. They were competing to have a brand that stood for rugged environmentalism and outdoor use. And they were also competing and measuring how they were doing on that scale. So to compete at any level, you must compete at every level. In the nonprofit world, we tend to have the opposite instinct. How can we do it for the best of reasons? How can we do it cheap? How can we do it for free? How can we do it for pro bono? How can we do it with whatever resources are left over, as opposed to what are the best resources available? And so we've started to organize ourselves to compete in that way. Last thing I would say is, what is at stake as we start to think about how we redefine and re-understand poverty in America today? As we all know, the stakes are enormously high, and in a real-time way, the Congress, which is considering the Farm Bill, is under the best of circumstances going to cut the SNAP food stamp program. The Senate, the Democratic-controlled Senate, has proposed a $4 billion cut. The Republican-controlled House, a $20 billion cut. We have 47 million Americans on food stamps for the first time in the history of the United States. Half of them are children. Secretary Vilsack told me recently that of all the kids in America today, 1/2 of them will be on food assistance at some point in their lifetime. So this is uncharted territory, just as poverty moving into the suburbs is uncharted territory. We are in uncharted territory. And probably the biggest cut of all will come to something called SNAP Ed, which is a nutrition education program that does what you would think everybody would want it to do, which is to make sure that families know how to stretch their food dollars, know how to make choices that are healthy for their kids, but that's considered in this day and age a luxury. We know from a study we just did with Deloitte that showed in the schools where we're working, math scores are 17.5% higher, attendance rates are a day and a half longer. Attendance correlates to reading on grade level. Reading on grade level correlates to graduation rates. We know that investments that some think we may not be able to afford to make are investments that we can't afford not to make. Hopefully, this important book will help people understand that as well. We can't have a strong America with weak kids. We can't have a healthy economy with unhealthy kids. We can't have kids who are prepared to, and an economy that's prepared to compete in the 21st century with children who are not prepared to learn. Something that James Baldwin, the author, once said, and I think Mary came very close to saying it, was that these are all our children, and we will profit by or pay for whatever they become. Let's hope we have the wisdom to make sure that what they become is smart and healthy and compassionate and wise and fully prepared to be part of America in the 21st century. Thank you for having me here today. Thanks for the work you've done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Billy, for an inspiring message that I think was chock full of the way that we confront the issues we're talking about today. Going big, focusing on capacity, and the organizations you heard from on the panel are doing just that, acting in an accountable and outcome-focused way, and re-examining our old assumptions about where poverty is and how to fight it that are in many cases decades out of date. So I think that was just right in line with the challenges we're facing today and some of the solutions that are emerging out of metropolitan America. As Elizabeth and I write in the book, this is not an issue that we came to out of some lifelong obsession with the suburbs. We grew up there and then we got out of there and we moved to Washington, D.C. But our hope is that this book and the conversations that we're hoping to stage around the country to follow really spark a serious dialogue about how to meet the challenge of poverty in America today at its true scale. And we couldn't really have asked for a better start to that conversation than the effort we had here today. Thank you all so much for being a part of it.